this off. Awesome. Greetings, comrades. Peace. How you doing? Let's give folks a couple more seconds. All right. Okay, word. So I think we have a good group of folks. Peace, comrades. How you doing? Nina Brown here again. He, their pronouns, and organizer with Boston PSL, and teacher with the Boston Teachers Union, Local 66. And welcome to our third installment of our political education series with Comrade Jodi Dean. Comrade Jodi Dean, as I'm sure you all are aware, a very prolific author, revolutionary, I say communist revivalist, has written the wonderful book Comrade, an essay on political belonging, democracy, and democracy and other neoliberal fantasies, the communist horizon, as well as crowds and party. So today we're going to be discussing our this topic of the end of comradeship. We've been kind of weaving through what does it really mean, or what has it historically meant to be a comrade, and what's the theory of the comrade, and some of the historical examples that really exemplify that. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it off to Comrade Jodi to begin, and I think it's gonna be around 20-25 minutes or so. And I encourage folks to take notes and write their questions in the chat. We can really have a live discussion. So thank you, Comrade. So take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Comrade. And really, I want to really thank you, Comrade Nino, and thanks to Comrade Marissa for putting this together, and Nino for kind of facilitating this. I really appreciate it. And really thank you for all the comrades who've joined in the discussion and spent time the last few weeks coming to this webinar. This is the third webinar drawing from the book Comrade. Just to remind folks of where we've gone. In the first session, I introduced the idea of comrade as a mode of address, carrier of expectation, and figure of political belonging. Comrades are those who share a politics, those on the same side. I also talked about the difference between the comrade and other kinds of relations, such as relations between kin, between neighbors, citizens, friends, and allies, right? Comradeship is not the same. We can differentiate those different kinds of forms of belonging. Last week, in our second session, I presented 4 theses on the comrade. 1, comrade names a relation characterized by sameness, equality, and solidarity. 2, anyone, but not everyone, can be a comrade. 3, the individual is the other or opposite of the comrade. And 4, the relation between comrades is mediated by fidelity to a truth that's expressed in the world through practical work. Now, in our discussions, I've tried to bring out the way that the very term comrade gives us an understanding of politics that exceeds individual conviction and choice. Comrade points to expectations of solidarity as indispensable to political action. We show up to meetings we would otherwise miss, do political work we might avoid, and try to live up to our responsibilities to each other. We experience the joy of committed struggle, of learning through practice. We overcome fears that might overwhelm us were we forced to confront them alone. My comrades make me better, stronger than I could ever be on my own. So with that as the background that we've been talking about, what I'm going to discuss today is what happens when comradeship ends. What happens when people are no longer comrades. Now, this is sort of a gloomy conclusion to the webinar series. So why do it? Well, there's a few reasons. It helps us cement the importance of comradeship by drawing out what we lose when comradeship ends. For another, there's a whole genre of memoirs by ex-communists that map a journey from being duped or deceived and then waking up to reality. And so this anti-communist writing makes it seem like people in the Communist Party were always deluded and oppressed, and then all of a sudden they free their minds and see the truth. Well, this is wrong. It's inaccurate. It's Cold War propaganda. And so knowing the different ways that comradeship ends can help us refute these misconceptions when we encounter them. Additionally, there can be good reasons for comradeship to end. Communists have expelled their members for racism and sexism and other sorts of bigotry. Socialist groups have split when some start to think that class struggle is unimportant or revolution is unnecessary. Finally, it's not always the case that the end of comradeship is permanent. In the history of the Communist Party in the US, there's a fascinating case where a comrade was expelled and still provided with a path back. And that's what I'll talk about towards the end of my remarks today. Now, most of us have encountered, just a second. Most of us have encountered people who think of themselves as on the left, as socialist, and maybe even as communist. Right? We've encountered these folks, so they think of themselves that way, but yet they don't want to be in a party. Sometimes they say that they don't want to be in a party because they're skeptical about the very strength that gives us our capacity, party discipline. Other times, these kind of non-affiliated leftists are afraid of being let down or betrayed. Won't it all ultimately fail, as it seems to them to have failed so many times before? Isn't it the case that comrades have inflicted harms on each other in the name of comradeship? And aren't there examples of persistent sexism, racism, bigotry, and bias in socialist and in the socialist and communist parties in the US and Europe? These are the sorts of questions that press us to think about the end of comradeship. And of course, we should be clear, much of the time when we hear these questions, they aren't actually raised in good faith, right? There's a critical tendency for many of these kind of non-affiliated leftists, particularly leftist intellectuals, but not only. But there's a kind of tendency for these questions. I mean, there's a tendency for people to raise these questions when they're actually just rejecting an idea because it could fail in the future. So they ask these questions like, oh, well, might things go wrong later? And it's a way to avoid even getting started at all. Right? So the questions sometimes mask a failure of political will that would actually be totally unconvincing in any other context. It's like the equivalent of saying, well, don't meet that person for coffee in case you fall in love and then later have an expensive and hateful divorce. Or don't speak at that meeting in case you lose your train of thought and end up sounding stupid. Or don't take up a new sport or exercise because you might get injured and you'll never be good at it anyway. Don't live because you will inevitably die. Worries about the end prevent people from even getting started. I mean, yeah, it's the case, right? Relationships end, failures happen, but that's nothing to fear. It's something to learn from, a next step. We can actually learn from the end of comradeship. So today I want us to try to think about the ways we can learn from the end of comradeship. And I'm going to talk about 3 types of ending. Resignation, right? Like when someone resigns. Drift, like when you just sort of fade away from your involvement. And 3, expulsion. And I'll spend most of the time on expulsion. Now, these 3 different ends of comradeship, resignation, drift, and expulsion, they're not always distinct. Sometimes they blend together. But thinking about them separately lets us open up the ways that the loss of comradeship has differing causes and effects and differing results and outcomes. They also remind us of the fact that an end should not keep people from beginning. Okay, resignation. The memoirs of former communists tend to tell dramatic stories of resignation. Membership cards are torn to pieces. Former comrades icily address each other as citizen, Mr. or Miss. Some present the end of comradeship as liberation. For example, in the first of his two memoirs, novelist Howard Fast, and he wrote the novel Spartacus. You know, it was in the movie with Kirk Douglas, where everyone's like, "I am Spartacus, I am Spartacus," right? To prevent the one person who started the instigation from being prosecuted. So Howard Fast was a novelist, and he wrote a couple of memoirs. And in his memoirs, he describes his decision to resign from the U.S. Communist Party. And he describes it as an awakening from a long and terrible nightmare. His recollections in the memoir shift between his fears of self-extinction, the loss of his individual conscience, his acknowledgement of the and his acknowledgement of the party's role in his success as a writer, Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech at the 20th Party Congress, and his own longing to leave the party that had actually lasted as long as he was a member. So he combines all of these different features in his memoir. And he writes, "The nightmare specified that whosoever left discarded all hopes of salvation. This was not easy to live with. Did one begin to leave the party when one had entered it? Does one always?" End quote. So although Fast actually testifies to his admiration for rank and file cadre, his individualist investment in his career as a writer, even as it was boosted by the party, his individualist investment in this, as well as his testimony to constant ambivalence, make one wonder if he ever was a comrade. So he tries to tell the story about this nightmare awakening, but yet the whole nightmare awakening story is actually accompanied by perpetual ambivalence, perpetual uncertainty, perpetual doubt in what he's doing, as well as a recognition that he's benefited from it, and a recognition of the strength of his comrades. Other stories of resignation testify to the impact of changes in the party's line. For example, and this is going to be another example from the US Communist Party, one of the examples of the impact and changes to the party's line comes from the way that the CP turned away from the emphasis on Black people's right of self-determination, right? That change in their line had real effects on the membership. In 1950, oddly, Queen Mother Moore resigned from the CP. Now, she said that she had quote, loved the party to death, but that she couldn't go along with its abandonment of a commitment to Black people as an oppressed nation. Moore became a well-known Black nationalist activist and proponent of reparations for slavery. She explained in an interview that she could not even get the party to discuss the question, much less engage in any self-criticism and admit its errors. Members were afraid to talk about the impact of the turn away from the Black self-determination line. And they were also unable to provide each other with support, encouragement, and confidence that are all necessary for meaningful party work, for practical optimism. So she was convinced that the party was no longer a champion of Black liberation, and thus left and found other avenues of struggle. So here we have two different examples of resignation. One that is very much caught up in the person's kind of individualism, and the other one that's a matter of real political conviction. So not every story of resignation is the same, and one shouldn't let the kind of Cold War memoirs of anti-communist become the one stand-in, this kind of story that stands totally for what it means to resign. Okay, second kind of end of comradeship is drift. The end of comradeship is not always dramatic or clear. For some, the intense intimacy of political work slowly dissipates, kind of worn away by exhaustion and disillusionment. Disappointments build up. Finding one's efforts meaningful and worthwhile becomes harder than doing the work. One CP organizer explained that he didn't resign over a specific cause. He stayed on for a number of years. Quote, "The world didn't end with a bang, it ended with a whimper. The heart was just slowly leaking out of me," end quote. The heart leaks out. The sense of intense connection with people on the same side of a struggle diminishes. People realize that their expectations of themselves and of each other have changed. The anti-communist democratic socialist Irving Howe describes how members' attachment to the socialist sect that he was part of slowly diminished. Quote, "A solid rank and filer who for years had collected dues now disappeared without a trace. It's unnerving. He simply stops coming to meetings, a dead soul." So someone expected to show up didn't. That person didn't live up to the expectations comrades have of each other, not even to the extent of explaining why. Howe links the dissolution of their group to the members' efforts to revise or get beyond Marxism. Critical discussion failed to clarify key concepts, resulting instead in fundamental revisions to formerly central ideas and instilling doubts as to the very purpose of the organization. What had been vital became pointless. Howe writes, "It becomes an ordeal to attend a meeting. You meet people you like, yet can hardly bear to look at. Like votaries of a lapsed religion, we go through the routines of business and discussion. We count our losses. We watch from the corners of our eyes to see who is dropping out." Diminished involvement then leads to diminished attachment. Disconnected from common ideas, practices, and struggles, right? From the set of truths that brought people together. Disconnected from that, people lost their capacity to see one another as comrades. And worse, they stopped wanting to see others that way, right? So they stopped even feeling there was a reason to try. There's not one end of comradeship, there are many. After splitting off from one formation, some comrades go on to start new ones. So you can think here of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who resigned from the German Social Democratic Party and started the Communist Party of Germany. Similarly, when Jay Lovestone and his comrades were expelled from the US Communist Party, they insisted they were still communist and named their new association the Communist Party, parentheses, Opposition. Although British feminist Sylvia Pankhurst announced, "I am tired, comrades. I have had a long and hard struggle." So she made that announcement when she was expelled from the Communist Party of Great Britain. But even though she was so exhausted, she began putting together a communist workers group and then became engaged with anti-fascist and anti-colonial struggles. Other former comrades recant, betray, and inform. Harvey Mattisau never found the feeling of belonging, of knowing who he was, of being someone that led him to join the CP. So he became an FBI informant and was expelled from the party, and then became a professional anti-communist witness, one of a number of professional anti-communist witnesses who became infamous during the McCarthy era. His lover, Elizabeth Bentley, also made a career out of being a renegade, selling herself to the media as the Red Spy Queen. Some former comrades become sworn enemies. Others find ways to call each other comrade again. And this then leads me to the third end to comradeship that I'm going to discuss, expulsion. Since at least the Moscow trials of the 1930s, liberals and socialists have derided communist parties for expelling their members. In particular to liberals, expulsion seems an indication of dogmatism and intolerance, a failure of democratic inclusion. But from the perspective of communists, expulsion is a matter of discipline. And as an aside here, I want to add, in his essay, Letter to a Comrade on Our Organizational Tasks, Lenin talks about how democratic centralism works not through rules, but by comradely influence. Right, so this this lets us see how it makes sense that someone who can't be relied on to fight together with us for a common future, someone who's instead going in their own direction, right? Someone who doesn't join us in opposition to bigotry and imperialism, right? They might need to be expelled. We can't see ourselves as being on the same side because they don't appear to be working for the goals we all share, right? Comradely influence doesn't work anymore. Trotsky observed at the 11th Party Congress, quote, "It was inadmissible for party members to speak about their comrades and leaders in terms of we and they. For if they did, they would, whatever their intentions, oppose themselves to the party," end quote. Our side fragments and the sense that the same can be expected of everyone gives way to an awareness that factions are united around their own expectations. Now, I want to consider in a lot more detail a really specific example from the Communist Party of the United States. And this happened in 1931 when the CP put a Finnish worker, August Jokinen, on trial. It was in a giant show trial, and they put him on trial for racial prejudice, for upholding white superiority, and for forwarding views detrimental to the working class. Now, in this kind of trial that the party held, some 1,500 Black and white workers attended. It was held in the Harlem Casino, which was one of the biggest halls in the area. Clarence Hathaway, who was the white editor of the Daily Worker, presented the case for prosecuting Jokinen. Richard B. Moore, who was one of the party's most highly regarded Black speakers, he carried Jokinen's defense. And then a jury was chosen out of the audience of Black and white workers, and it consisted of 14 workers, 7 who were Black, 7 who were white, and so the jury then delivered the verdict. Okay, so let me say the background of like how this whole trial got started and what Jokinen did and all that. So Jokinen was one of 3 white party members who had been working the door for a dance in Harlem's Finnish Workers Club, right? It was the club for a lot in that period of time. A lot of workers' organizations were done around, were still being done in ethnic groups, and like the Finnish workers. So there was this Finnish Workers Club, and they were having a dance, and several Black workers arrived for the dance, and they were only reluctantly admitted. Once they got in the door of the club, right, once they were allowed in, they were treated with such hostility that they soon left. None of the white party members welcomed or defended them. During the party's investigation of the incident, Jokinen's comrades admitted their error. But Jokinen tried to justify his behavior by explaining that he thought the Black workers would go into the pool room and that he didn't want to bathe with Black people. So, of course, there has to be, something has to happen. Well, by the time that the trial starts, right, by the time of the party trial, Jokinen had actually acknowledged, yeah, he was guilty, and he promised to rectify it and do concrete work in behalf of the struggle for Black liberation. So even before the trial starts, he has actually admitted his error. Still, the question before the jury was whether or not he should be expelled from the party for his racism, or in the language of the time, white chauvinism, or maybe should he just be put on probation. So even though he'd admitted it by that point, there was still the question, is this really bad for the party if he's allowed to continue? Should he be put on some probation? How should we go? How should we proceed? At the trial, Hathaway made the arguments for the prosecution. And he emphasized that Jokinen not only failed to act in accordance with the Communist Party's egalitarian expectation, but that his failure put him on the side of lynchers and landlords. Even the slightest expression of white racial superiority undermined class solidarity and strengthened the bourgeoisie. So when Jokinen failed to uphold the party's commitment to racial equality, he gave Black workers good reason to expect nothing but betrayal from the party and from any white person. Hathaway reminded the jury that because the struggle for the equal rights of Black people was indispensable to the proletarian struggle, the Communist Party had to prove in action that it was committed to wiping out every trace of white chauvinism. Expelling Jokinen would demonstrate this commitment. But Hathaway also offered Jokinen a path back to the party. If he fought actively against white supremacy, selling the black newspaper, The Liberator, and reporting on his trial at the Finnish Workers' Club, then he should be able to apply for readmission. So that's the prosecution, right? They want him to be able to apply to be readmitted, but that he if he can demonstrate his commitment, but he has to be expelled. Moore's defense shifted the focus to the real enemy, the capitalist class. Moore argued that the landlords and the bourgeoisie were the ones who spread the poison of race hatred, aided by trade union and socialist opportunists. Moore's point was not that Jokinen should not be held accountable. It was that no one was innocent. Every aspect of capitalist imperialism spreads the corrupt ideology of white superiority. So Moore turned his critique back on the Communist Party, asking whether it had done the requisite educational work to confront race hatred. Had it developed programs for the workers' movement to explain the significance and crucial nature of the struggle against lynching? Had the CP made a serious effort to root out prejudice? Moore declared that the answer was no. The party shared in Jokinen's crime. So he concluded that self-criticism, not expulsion, was the better way. Self-criticism would enable the party to prove its commitment through its deeds. An added benefit, Moore argued, was that self-criticism would save Jokinen for the struggle, a crucial factor when every worker was needed to be brought into the effort to bring the capitalist system down. In his summation, Moore reminded the jury of the seriousness of expulsion from the Communist Party. Quote, "I would rather have my head severed from my body by the capitalist lynchers than be expelled from the Communist International," Moore said. He meant that being cut off from the party, separated from one's comrades and deprived of their comradeship, is a fate worse than death. It's a kind of social death where a worker becomes an outsider to his own movement, a person as bad or worse than the capitalists themselves. Moore concluded that Jokinen should be condemned, but more important is condemning capitalism for the misery, prejudice, terror, and lynching it breeds. The party needed to save and educate the comrade to give him a chance to prove himself. The party also had to engage in ruthless struggle against white chauvinism and against anything else that threatened class unity. So, we've got the prosecution, defense. What happens? Well, the jury finds Jokinen guilty, which is actually not surprising since he had already admitted that he was guilty. And Jokinen agreed to expel him, but they were split on whether the expulsion should be 6 or 12 months. They accepted the prosecution's suggestions for the ways Jokinen could correct his mistakes, right? That he needs to sell the Liberator and fight against white chauvinism. So even though Jokinen was expelled, he remained a comrade. The trial resulted in a decision that affirmed his role in the class struggle, a role focused on building unity between Black and white workers. The party didn't cut him off. It provided him with a path back. The day after the trial, Jokinen was arrested and held for deportation. The Comintern-backed International Labor Defense defended him during his deportation hearings. Now, the Jokinen trial teaches a number of important lessons about comradeship. The first set of lessons concern being on the same side. The prosecution and the defense shared the same principles and goals: working class unity, the abolition of white supremacy, the necessity of racial equality in action in everyday life, and proletarian revolution. Common principles enabled them to discern and name the common enemy: capitalists and landlords promulgating white supremacy and lynch law. Anyone who accepted these common principles was a comrade, even when they made mistakes. That they were a comrade meant that they were valuable to the struggle. They just needed to be taught, trained. The revolution needs as many recruits as it can get. The second set of lessons follow from the first, the value of collective self-criticism. If one of our comrades errs, we share responsibility for that mistake. What could we have done to prevent it? What kind of instruction or guidance could we have provided? We're all surrounded by capitalism's racist ideology all the time. We need to support one another in the fight against it. We must condemn actions that reinforce white supremacy and condemn even more strongly the system that breeds it. Finally, the third set of lessons involve the path back. In the Jokinen case, the Communist Party aimed for unity. It pursued practices that built this unity rather than unraveling it. Even someone expelled from the party wasn't completely condemned. In fact, when he came up against the aggressive power of the imperialist state, the party took the lead in defending him. Jokinen was still on the same side as the communists. He was still a comrade. He accepted the party's decision about the work he needed to do to combat white supremacy and build working class unity. What was at stake wasn't moralism, the need for an apology, or an individualistic judgment regarding his attitude. What mattered was doing the work revolutionary struggle demands. To sum up, we can learn from the end of comradeship, right? That it ends in different ways. Right? We can learn what sorts of things to be on the lookout for, and we can learn that it doesn't have to be final. Most of all, we get a sense more and more of how important comradeship is for communists. It gives us the capacity to accomplish together what we could never do apart, a capacity to endure and to win. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Comrade. That was very, very powerful. I see a couple of questions. Oh, Natalie. Okay, nice. Can hear now. So if comrades want to put questions into the chat, please do so now. We have one. It's kind of a long one, but I think we can condense this. So basically, this comrade has read the excerpt that you pulled from the Harry Haywood's Black Belt thesis on the 0 level for communism paper, and their understanding was that during the 1930s, the CPUSA adopted seeing the Black community as a nation. And after, battling their own internal white chauvinism to come to that position, what happened in that time that made the CPUSA change their stance, making the comrade that you mentioned leave?
So my best recollection is that they start to abandon this as they take a shift to the center later in the 30s and in the 40s, right? As they become more and more a mainstream party during the struggle against fascism, they start to want to do more cooperative work with more mainstream organizations, and they end their more radical line. And this goes back and forth some in the 40s, but by 1950, they had really pushed away from the more radical line. But it goes back and forth. It's not 100%. It's not like it goes away 100%, right? There's a time when, what was it? Oh God, I can't remember the name of who was the head of the party when they dissolved as a party in the 1940s.
Earl Browder?
Yeah, Earl Browder. So it was like during the Browder period, they moved very much to the mainstream. And then Browder dissolves the party and they become a communist organization or association. But that also only lasts for about a year, and then they become a party again and end up even having to move a lot of people underground, and then it really goes downhill. But for the most part, it was because of a move to the mainstream and a wanting to not take as a revolutionary line as they had. That's my understanding of why they changed.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, comrade. So we have a couple more questions coming in here. One is about drift. How can we prevent comrades from drifting? Is this something that happens solely because of the comrade that is drifting? Like if it's, for example, individualism, or is it the fault of the branch or the party? So I think if you could speak to drift, the causes of it, consequences, how do you combat it?
Yeah, I think that drift. So I think that the question is great, and I think that one of the things that we also learned from the Yochanan case is that we always have to turn back. Anytime, it's never going to be the fault of one person, right? You always have to bring back and see what's at stake in the organization or the branch. And so when we think about that, we can say. I think there are various things that branches can do and that the party can do. And it's like, and one thing is, are we making sure that we are putting comrade strengths and talents to use? Are we making sure that comrades have tasks and responsibilities? Um, are we checking in with comrades, or does branch leadership start to just do everything themselves and only communicate with each other? Or are we actively making sure that we're always checking in with everyone? I mean, my in our party rules, we're supposed to make sure that we have that we that we hold each other accountable to make sure everyone's involved, and check up on everybody once a year to say, okay, has everyone been still coming to meetings and doing the work? And if they haven't, it's not necessarily only the fault of the comrade who isn't coming, but the fact of it's partially the other comrades, about creating a set of opportunities for more involvement, for more engagement. So I think that that combating drift is something that is everyone's, like all comrades' responsibility, and it really does involve making sure that everyone has task and responsibility where they can contribute.
Mm. I think that's a really excellent response. To make a short addition, I was reading Georgy Dimitrov's his book Unity Against Fascism, and there's a section where he talks about cadres and the Communist Party of Germany is saying, well, we don't have the cadres that the Bolsheviks had, and he turns them to this wonderful quote from Lenin saying that in order to find cadres, you really have to know your own people. You know, he was saying some of the communists in Russia were saying, we don't have any people, we don't have any cadres, and he was like, well, you have to study and get to know your people, and that's what Lenin and Amilcar Cabral and Mao did. They really studied their people that well that they really knew their strengths and weaknesses as individuals, but also as a nation, like the history of the Chinese nation, the history of the Russian Empire. So in my experience, that's what I've seen, just really studying and getting to know, like, who are the folks, in your branch, and what are the strengths and weaknesses, and provide those opportunities. So there's another question here. If a comrade has been expelled, what potential is there for rehabilitation and a return to the party from which they were expelled? That's a more, I think, general question. Various parties handle it differently.
Right. So, so we're thinking about, this is a general question, right? Yeah, and is that right, Nina? We're thinking about that generally, right?
I believe so. I mean, according to this comrade, yes, I would say so.
So, the lessons that I think that we take from the Yochanan case, and I should add in here, Harry Haywood thinks that this case is perfect, and he calls it's an example of rectification and the rectification strategies that the party should use. Like he was critical of some of the ways that the party combated white chauvinism only with expulsion and not with rectification, which I think tells us that any kind of strategy that only has expulsion and doesn't think about ways to let a comrade come back is one-sided. And so it would seem to me that the lesson here is, does the comrade accept, does the comrade recognize that what they were expelled for was an error? Do they understand what, do they, at first, do they recognize it as an error? Do they understand why it's an error? Do they regret making the error? Do they want, so if that all first level, and it couldn't just be like, well, let's just agree to disagree, or everyone, I mean, it's got to be like a really substantial understanding of why something was an error. And then I think a kind of period of work on behalf of sort of the common goals that really shows the dedication. And that both of those things, is as the jury agreed on the Jokinen case, seemed to me to be quite reasonable ways of approaching and understanding the path back for a comrade who has been expelled.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. I think that we have another question here, but I think just to speak to that a little bit, this is a question of my own, of what has changed in the conception of what is the work, because in the 1920s and 30s, the work might have been picketing, mass strikes, leading up struggles against the war in Ethiopia, and more particular things like that. But today, when we have a different relation of class forces, and the work may take the form of, what you write about, these hegemonic ideas around allyship, where the work today may look like, polemicizing against someone on Twitter, or the work to them, or today, it may be conceived as really adrift or separated from a mass character. And does that kind of feed into how we deal with resignations today? And I want you to kind of speak to like communicative capitalism and how it kind of magnifies these things. And we have another question, but yeah, I think.
Can I answer that one first, Nino? Is that okay? Is that okay before the next one?
Yes, we only have one other question here.
Oh, okay. So the first thing on how does the work differ? I think that part would probably have to be on a kind of specific case-by-case basis, right? So depending, like in the Jokinen case, what's really interesting is that, I mean, his crime was, bigotry and white, in their language, white chauvinism, right? We'd call that, just racism and white superiority. And I think that, or white supremacy. And I think so for that one, his being involved in really direct anti-racist work was important. So he sold the paper, The Liberator, and he had to go back and talk at the Finnish Workers' Center about the trial, right? About the importance of opposition to lynch law, about the importance of making sure that all white workers were on the same side as Black workers. So there, what we see is the tasks that he is given fit fit the crime, right? The punishment fits the crime. But it's not even more like, that's not a great way to say it, because it's not really like punishment. It's just like, show the work that makes it clear that you are rectifying the error that you committed. So that's what I would think that the rule of thumb would be. How do you show how do you do the work that rectifies the error that you committed? And I don't think there's more than, I don't think we can be more specific in that without thinking of various cases. On the communicative capitalism side, so just as a general background, part of my writing over the last, and research over the last 20 years looks at our contemporary capitalist present in terms of communication networks and say personalized participatory media. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of language, the communicative capitalism is my term for this deep investment of capitalism in everyone's online communication. And everyone's online communication. And on that one, I would not say that measuring someone, I mean, I guess I don't think that people could go out there and, like, I would not call going out there and criticizing the enemy online as appropriate rectification. I mean, it seems like that seems to me the wrong thing, or just saying, well, if you share the party's material, you know, our party's stuff 10 times, that's rectified. Like that seems like not the direction I would go in myself. I would want something more substantial. Did I misunderstand your comment? Or
I think that's spot on. I think with regard to your from allies to comrades article, where, you know, I think you mentioned some may say, well, go study this topic by yourself, or, you know, or just Google it, and how that type of work differs from the work that Jokinen had to do. But I did want to give other comrades a chance to kind of to get to their questions, because this is our last week. I mean, we can follow up. So we have a lot more questions. So some of these are about particular time periods and individuals. So for example, if there are rifts between comrades, such as fissures around the relationship between like Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, can those type of fissures be repaired? You know, these ideological fissures. What are the important ways that you think the party does or could facilitate development of the attributes of comradeship amongst ourselves? And just fit one more right in and kind of take them in different bits and pieces. Do you see a connection between periods of mass resignations and dogmatism in the party? So is there a connection there? So for example, the lack of political sophistication on the part of the CPUSA and uncritically supporting the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, seems to have hurt the membership. So if you could speak to that connection between mass resignations and dogmatism, and just really following the Soviet line to a fault.
Okay, so first on how to develop the attributes of comradeship, I actually think that's really done in practice through common work together. I think the more that people interact together and have expectations of one another that we fulfill, the more that we feel a responsibility towards one another. And I think at the basis of comradeship is this sense of we have shared expectations. I also think at the basis of comradeship is discipline. And when we say we're going to do something, we know the person's going to be there, right? We build our sense of, yes, we're strong because I can rely on the fact that 40 people are going to show up this afternoon and be there. So I think that it's through the practical work that's the most important element for building comradeship, is the practical work and the discipline that goes with it. On the really complex question with the Chinese example, I don't think I have a good answer, right? Because the question is like, can things be mended? But sometimes it's the case, also sometimes should be the case is, should things be mended? Because sometimes there can be a real principled reason for an end to comradeship. And I mean, and I think we've got to accept both things, that sometimes we have to mend them and sometimes a break is necessary. And the part of the kind of political wisdom and judgment is being able to know when it is. And the thing is, you won't ever know 100% for certain. There's not going to be like a rule book that tells you, oh, this was the time when you should have stood together and this was the time when you should have broken, right? That's always going to be kind of, in the theoretical language I like, retroactively determined, right? It's only determined later. You don't know at the time, and you can't know at the time. So I think that, yes, you know, many times things can be mended and repaired, particularly, but the question is, should they be? Or are these questions, is the division so principled and such a remarkably different view of the struggle or of the future or of the society that's being built that one needs to break? On periods of, and so on I'm also going to kind of fudge a little bit the periods of mass resignation question. And in part, I guess I feel like the attack on the CP as dogmatic is, I guess I'm not 100% sure I think that necessarily is correct, right? And you hear lots of parties criticized just as Stalinist. You hear any people who have party unity criticized as tankies. And so does it make sense to blame them for dogmatism and you explain mass resignation there? Or could it be the fact of the police repression and the imprisonment of leaders, the longest trials in history happening, and people having to go underground? Maybe that's part of it. I'm not trying to defend dogmatism, but I'm also trying to be reluctant to go that direction. Then I think, if something like, someone as wonderful as Angela Davis joins the party in 1968, right? That sort of says like, well, maybe this party that other people were, saying was dogmatic in the 40s and 50s still had something to offer. And so that's why I'm gonna pull back rather than kind of agree that it's dogmatism.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Comrade. So we have a couple more questions piling in here. Another question is, it seems that there's a connection between the end of comradeship in all the manifestations that you mentioned and either political developments in the country or world or organization tied to like political mistakes within the party. So I guess if you could speak to the end of comradeship and these kind of like larger world historical events that for some, I think as you mentioned, kind of like ends their worlds for folks who did end their comradeship or resign. And there's another question, just because we have about, I think, a couple minutes left. One of the major factors of drift can be capitalism's destructive effects on mental health. How much responsibility should the party assume for mitigating the effects of capitalism, on mental health?
Wow, those are both really good questions. On the sort, and I think both of them get at the same kind of thing, which is namely the external pressures that come in on the party and hurt relationships between people in the party, and how the external pressures become so great that the party may react in ways that are dogmatic or ways that are what we can later see are mistakes in its line or mistakes in its judgment. So both of the questions seem to be about thinking about what happens externally to the party. And once we start to recognize that, okay, the party is always going to be experiencing external pressures, right? Whether or not these pressures are one set of world historical events, whether or not they're the kind of horrible grind of capitalism, and like the language we might now use is like for gig workers and precarity and uncertainty, and then the mental health stress of that, or the mental health horrors of like constant little beeps judging everything that you're doing, like if you're working in an Amazon warehouse or something like that. So I think that maybe the best way to try to approach these questions is thinking, what are the best ways for the party to strengthen itself and strengthen the relations among members of the party, strengthen comradeship in the face of all external threats, right? I don't think it's just going to be this set or that set. And that seems to me to be the case, again, practical work and the democratic centralism, right? The democratic centralism where you're able to discuss matters together in the branch and then come to a decision that is building party unity rather than one that is really, repressing a kind of self-criticism, like Audley Moore was talking about, right? Like she was really unhappy that they couldn't even talk about it. So I think in both cases, like I don't want to sort of highlight specific world events, but just recognize the pressure is always going to be there on a socialist and communist party, right? It's all like whether or not it's going to be infiltrators, whether or not it's going to be another party, one's allied with that does something terrible, whether or not it's going to be horrible world events. I mean, finding the ways to respond and adapt together is always going to be the challenge.
Awesome. Word. Well, thank you, Comrade.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming to this.
Definitely. So I believe this is our last installment. So if you have not already, highly encourage you to get the book Comrade by Jodi Dean, as well as other books. Crowds and Parties, that was my gateway drug, Crowds and Parties. Um, but Comrades are definitely thanking you. And I'm not sure if there's any follow-up from this, but I think we may leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that.
Okay. So comrades, thank you all, and make sure to tune in tomorrow to our webinar. I believe it's going to be at if you check PSL's Facebook page, I think it's midday, 3 p.m. But other than that,
6 p.m. Eastern and 3 p.m. Pacific.
Awesome. Thank you, Comrade. 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. So without further ado, thank you, comrades, and y'all have a good evening.